So we've spoken about attachment styles and where it stems from. And I think that sort of touches the fundamentals of where it stems from, but also what it means. Like what are the different attachment styles, where the origins of it, and how does that sort of impact at a high level your relationships and the environment around you. The biggest one with this, though, there's actually a lot of neuroscience behind it. And there's a lot of brain chemistry. And I think if we look to, if we were to say, for example, secure attachment, a parent being involved, nurturing, and being there for the child in a healthy manner, will the different brain chemistry or different brain chemicals that are released in both the child and the primary caregiver will be very different to a child that has to fend for themselves because he hasn't received that nurturing, or the inconsistency as well, where there's been an inconsistent amount of nurturing or the emotional availability from the primary caregiver. Now, this is where it gets interesting because there's different chemicals that react differently with our bodies, and those different chemicals then dictate sort of how we then react in the future, because it's sort of, in a way, it's kind of predisposed because of the way you've absorbed that information at a young age. But walk me through like what you found doing in the neuroscience behind attachment styles.
Yeah, I mean, just to also mention that I'm not some sort of neuroscientist or anything. I'm just going based off research and just what I've read and what I've watched.
Yeah, very high level.
Yeah, very high level. And it's actually very interesting, like the neuroscience behind it. Like so I was reading about like some research articles. And so reading about like the National Institutes of Health, they found that when you have emotional reactions, there are two regions in your brain which translate emotion into how your physiological and your chemical reaction. And the two regions are, it's the amygdala and the hippocampus. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but amygdala is basically part of the brain which helps process emotions. And it's like the way I can explain it is it's like an alarm system. So an alarm system tries and detect any threats or danger, and then it tries to warn you. And that's exactly like how your amygdala works. And the hippocampus is just like the memory center where it stores all this information so that it when you encounter something similar, or it's to prevent you from encountering something that's going to lead towards danger. Because you have this memory stored in you, it's going to protect you in a sense, to prevent you from those situations. So you can see how they both go together in a way. The amygdala is just giving you a warning, whereas the hippocampus tries and stores these memories.
Right, okay.
And especially memories that have a lot of emotional significance. The more emotions that are tied to that memory, the more you'll most likely remember as well.
And that's where the hippocampus calls from it.
Yeah, the hippocampus comes.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting.
But what's interesting as well was that your hippocampus, which is the memory storage, is also affected by cortisol, right? Cortisol is like your stress hormone. So the more stress you have, I think it overworks your hippocampus to the point that you actually lose memories. So that creates then trauma, right? Because people lose memories. Well, people don't exactly remember what happened in that situation, but they have this emotion, like feeling of something.
That's incredible. And the reason I say that is because there's I don't know if this is true, but people that have experienced a lot of childhood trauma tend to not remember their childhood memories.
And I also found it's not just their childhood memories; they also don't remember things in general, in even their adulthood.
Really?
Yeah, some things they don't have good memory. And it's because I think a lot of it is with cortisol, right? Stress. Because they were as a child, that's already affected the brain, like the memory center and everything. Then even as an adult, I think it's just their reaction towards things, like towards people and everything is affected, right? How we talked about before. And that induces more stress. And the more stress you have, then the more you're overworking your parts of your body and your brain. And then I think that just leads to just, moments where they just forget things.
Wow. So it's not overstimulation, but the overuse technically of the hippocampus because of very stressful, like severe stressful environments that leads to hippocampus overloading itself in a way. And then that has an opposite reaction because your hippocampus draws from the emotions of that comes from the amygdala. Can't pronounce that word. Amygdala. But too much stress, your hippocampus won't actually draw from that. It'll start forgetting things.
Yeah, that's correct. And I'm like, that makes so much sense now with how brain and physiological chemical reaction and everything works in that sense.
Wow. Yeah. I'm going to take a minute to process that. That's great. Well,
but that, then if you think about it, explains a lot of the insecure attachments, right? How we went over like chaotic environments, and when you're in a lot of chaos, especially as a child, and since your brain is very malleable, like you have a lot of, they call it neuroplasticity, where your ability to learn, and it makes sense. Like they did an experiment, I remember, where they were teaching a child how to ride a bike versus an adult riding a bike, and the child learned how to ride a bike a lot faster than the adult. And that tells you that our neuroplasticity when we're young is a lot more, we have a lot more neuroplasticity, so we're able to learn a lot faster. Ironically, you'd think. Yeah, some people would think, oh, as an adult, you'd probably think more, like you'd be much faster. But when you're learning something completely new, no patterns, nothing involved, child is going to learn faster. So that's why they're able to learn languages and stuff a lot more faster than an adult. So with neuroplasticity, that's where that comes in. And I think there's studies for that which show how like your attachment styles can be affected by the neural connections that form with positive or negative experiences. And
then there's the opposite of that, right? The insecure attachments leading to negative behavior.
Which have like negative experiences that have
And that, I think it goes back to like goes back to how your childhood was in terms of your connection with your primary caregiver, right? At that point.
Yeah, definitely.
Isn't it fascinating though, in a way? Like it's just how these little things and then the neuroscience behind it as to what's happening is just absolutely incredible.
Yeah, and it makes so much sense as well. Like I think when you think about your life, we have a lot of cortisol throughout our life. I would say it's probably like 70%
cortisol is a stress hormone.
I'm just saying a random stat, but
like stress. Yeah,
you'd think about it. Like when you go to work, even those relationships you have that are professional, there's stress involved because there's numbers involved. You have to have you have to deliver a certain type of KPIs. You have to deliver sales. You have to be able to deliver at this time with this budget, so on and so forth. And see, those relationships still have stress behind it. And I think when we do work, when we do anything you do has stress involved. And the dopamine level relative to dopamine, which is like the pleasurable feeling you get, reward feeling, relative to the stress, it's like 70% of it is stress, 30% dopamine. And dopamine only lasts for a certain amount of time. Like when you have the ice cream, you eat it, and after that, it goes downhill. Then you come back to baseline. It's like very temporary.
Yeah, it's a bit like it's what drugs, like ecstasy or cocaine or stimulants. It's what it does. It's a false heighten of dopamine, the point, but then the come down or the crash that you experience is a lot worse because your dopamine, you kind of cook your baseline, dopamine baseline, maybe through consistent use, etc. But that's why like sort of deviating away just for a few moments, but acts of displeasure, actually, right? Like for example, like excessive masturbation. It's really, you feel really good at that moment in time, but excessive masturbation with porn, for example, it's great at that moment, but doing it excessively over a consistent period of time, you are essentially frying your dopamine levels. so that when you actually experience something genuine with a person, your dopamine levels are so high that you can't either get aroused or you can't get the same feeling that you would get from, watching pornography and
Yeah.
doing things with your penis.
Well, coming back to the topic, yeah, definitely. And I think like what I was trying to get at was that a lot of our life is already stress.
Yeah.
And then as a child, if your environment is already stressful, then as we said, it affects like your brain as well and your memory. And I think that's why it leads to a lot of other problems. And I think the main thing to prioritize is oxytocin. And oxytocin is, I think they call it like the love hormone or something, where it's when you're having physical interaction, you get oxytocin with people that obviously you care about and people that actually care about you. You get that pleasurable feeling you're having just going out and just seeing each other, talking to each other. That's oxytocin, the physical touch. And I think when you think about work these days and just how people interact, it's always online. So you can see how there's a lack of oxytocin there as well, because everyone's just on their phones or just digitally talking. No one really barely meets up these days. And I think oxytocin and serotonin are the two things that you want to prioritize in terms of like neurochemistry, because those are the things that give you longer lasting moments of pleasure. Whereas obviously and I feel like with dopamine, there's always stress, because with before you get to have that dopamine, which lasts for a few seconds and comes back to baseline normal, there's a lot of stress involved. Like think about your achievements. You've gotten a new job, new position, the decades of stress that went through that for like a higher executive position, the amount of stress you have to go through that. And then you get the position and you're like, wow, I got it. I feel amazing. 10 seconds. Then now you're back to square one.
Yeah.
And it's with anything, any new iPhone you buy, same thing. The amount of stress, you had to wait in line, thousands of hours you had to wait to be able to buy it, be the first person that buys it or something. And then now it's like back to square one. When's the next iPhone? And that's exactly that's why I don't really prioritize on dopamine and things like that. It's just a fleeting type of pleasurable feeling. But when I meet people, when I talk to them, that's a different experience.
Yeah.
Which is a lot longer lasting.
And I think we as humans are genetically disposed to actually have human interactions and human connectivity. How we are designed in a way is to have human interactions, because human interactions, you're right, is what leads to the oxytocin, the serotonin, they're feeling good. And you just don't feel good with yourself. You make other people feel good around you. And that's what I meant around the disconnection that we're seeing right now with people is it seems like there's a bit of a lack of those key neurotransmitters that are very important in relationship building, because everything is online. And so, for example, people being afraid to go up and speak to someone in person, it's a bit of an issue now, because it's like, I need to go experience this. Like, there's a lack of, you feel anxious at that point in time about doing it. So there's a heightened, your cortisol levels are through the roof. You're quite stressed, but you can't actually bring yourself to do it because you haven't experienced the oxytocin levels from actually speaking to people in person. And so you actually then become more anxious, you don't take action on it. But I think as you speak to more people in person and you get more comfortable, you realize, oh, I actually enjoy this. This is actually, I feel good about this. And this isn't about like, cold approaching girls and for a guy and asking the numbers, all that sort of stuff. It's just genuine conversation with everyday people, with strangers. I mean, it's hard to do that. It's hard to make that conversation, but I think, I've been fortunate in the environment I work in is that I get to speak to a lot of different people, learn about a lot of different things. I know some people don't have that privilege in a way. Because, work from home, one thing, but the nature of our roles very different as well. But it's interesting you say that, like that dopamine effect is it feels like that dopamine level has been prioritized so much because, again, like TikTok, for example, it's just a rush. Or Instagram Reels. I mean, the memes, when the memes are great, like it's that dopamine hit, and you feel good at that point in time. And I think memes are great for society. We need it. But yeah, you're right. There's a false sense of dopamine in a way that's being fostered in the environment that we're in.
Yeah, definitely. And what's also very interesting as well is like the physiological reactions that you have when you identify different attachment styles. And what happens physiological to chemical is quite interesting. Like with secure attachment, usually like the response with people is like when they experience emotions, it's more balanced. Like their heart rate and cortisol levels just only increase very slightly. It's not like all of a sudden like a random exponential increase. And then it's like because it's so steady, they're able to regulate it. And so that's why they're in more control. They are able to manage their emotions a lot effectively. But when you look at someone who's anxious, it's very different, because with an anxious person, they have more of an explosive reaction. So when you see them in environments where they're socially gathering people, it's like their heart rate increases significantly, and also their cortisol levels. So both go up. And I've seen this with someone as well. You could tell like their breathing is very shallow, they're shaking a lot, and just by identifying that, you can just tell like this person's anxious. And what she was thinking of doing was like drinking alcohol just to numb the pain, and I'm like, that's probably not the best thing to do. You should probably just go home or something if you're not feeling comfortable.
Get the pills.
Or maybe this is not like the right environment for you. Maybe this setting is not the right environment. You should probably, And I think that's just. But you see, the lack of awareness of these things, like this is your body telling you you're like in a very highly anxious state, and obviously where it came from could be from childhood and so many other factors. But you can see it through people, how they react and interact with people. I think that's very important as well. Being aware of that, why you are so anxious. And with anxious, it's like a downward spiral. Because you're anxious, other people see that you're anxious, you feel even more anxious. It's like your cortisol and your heart rate, everything's going like off the roof to the point you just faint. And I think, and that's like what the reaction, that's what's happening. So, and then whereas with avoidant, it's like the heart rate is it's very stable when it comes to interacting with people, but the cortisol levels are very low. So it's like they almost feel like they're cold. Like as in, they have like no emotion. They're emotionally completely detached to the situation, environment. Everyone's laughing and they're just like in the distance in the corner, like that meme. But they're just isolated, in a sense. And so their way of dealing with emotions is just ignoring it, being completely detached. And disorganized is very, very confusing because they have very alternative type of reactions. So, and their behavior is just there's so much going on at the same time. When you observe, it's just, you will see that they have very contradicting behaviors. They'll treat you very nicely, they'll treat you very negatively. It's just very confusing because of the environment they're in. It's very unstable. So then the emotional response, physiological response, the heart rate, cortisol, it's very, very, very unstable. And it just reflects in the way that they would talk to you, the way that they treat you. Yeah.
Very unpredictable.
Very unpredictable behavior, which is quite dangerous. But I mean, at the end of the day, it's being aware about these things.
Yeah, it is. And I think, I said this in the previous episode, but I think that Jay Shetty's episode of the attachment styles, where he gives you 6 questions. I don't want to take credit for that, go through that questionnaire. I think but maybe we can in the future. Maybe we can question each other and see where we're at. I think that'd be a good exercise. Seeing what sort of attachment styles we have. Because I also think not everyone is like very secure. I think there are moments where people can get avoidant, people can be anxious, and it's simply, I think we don't want to label it as a very negative, thing. I mean, the impacts it has and the consequences it has on your life is negative, but there's ways to change it. And I think, once you come across if you're anxious and avoidant, you come across someone that's secure, slowly the brain chemistry and what they bring, the calmness they bring, and if you're experiencing oxytocin at a heightened level, for example, with that partner, or you start to feel that secure attachment with them, and so you slowly then become secure in yourself rather than being avoidant or anxious. You might still have traits of it, but coming across someone that's secure, you'll start to exhibit that, and you'll start to change towards that. So I think that's a huge thing. But I think it comes from self-reflection as well. It's very important.
Yeah, like I like how you mentioned that at the end of the day, all of this is not permanent. It's obviously you can change it, and as we said, like with neuroplasticity, like your brain, even though you're an adult, you still have neuroplasticity. So obviously, you just gotta seek, like you gotta reflect, of course, to identify and understand, and then you go through like you take the actions of therapy or whatever it might be to be able to then give you a different perspective of how you perceived it. And especially going back to, if it's like a childhood thing, going back to that time and seeing it in a different frame is like very important as well. And that's the thing with neuroplasticity. It's like even your brain is malleable, right? It always can change. It takes a lot of effort and time and action to be able to renew that. Because it's like the neuroplasticity, you can think of it as like the best way to really think about it is like a bridge. Well, actually, what I would say is think of like a grass or like a field of grass, and imagine like a bike riding over it. It's like you see like the tire create like a path, but imagine that bike going over that 1,000 times. The path becomes more and more visible, and that's exactly like neuroplasticity. Through repetitive behaviors, through repetition, through action, and many other things, and giving yourself evidence, that pathway becomes very strong. But you can alter that based on your actions and things that you do to be able to renew it. So it's very important to...
It's a great analogy.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's very important, I think. And, yeah, nothing is permanent.
Genetic and environmental factors. What's the neuroscience there?
Yeah, so apparently there's differences in certain genes, and it can actually affect how your attachment styles and how you process basically information. So according to this study by Bakerman, I think that's how you say the name, they mentioned how individuals with variants of gene called OXTR, which is basically oxytocin receptor gene, you basically process information very differently, and it influences your attachment security.
So this is being looked at a genetic level now, rather than just at a childhood level. It's like you might be born with a certain receptor that might stop you from building relationships with people, for example, compared to if you don't have it, you can. And holy. Okay.
But like it comes back to what you were saying, right? Because I remember you mentioned the previous one that it's like we have also
generational trauma.
Yeah, generational trauma. Right? And that can come from like moments of famine or war or something. That was very significant that it affected generations. That's
interesting. Yeah. I didn't think it would affect your genetics as much though. See, I think I thought of it as more as your great-granddad did it to your granddad to your dad does it to you. But it seems like there's a bit of a genetic part to that as well then, that maybe if you go down 7 generations, for example, I'm just making this up, by the way, the emotions and what you feel and the neurotransmitters you feel then, because that will determine your genetic in a way, right? And I'm not a genetic expert. I'd love to speak to someone, a genetic expert, but it seems like trauma can actually change your genetics a bit. And so when you actually have a child, your offspring, there's a higher chance your offspring will also have those traits. Is that what it's sort of looking at?
Yeah, I think it would be more of like extreme.
Like very extreme
circumstances, because it'd take a lot of famine, like having decades of famine cycles and things like war and things like that would really, and being raised in an environment around that, and, being born around that, it would really, I think, does affect. But I think one thing that I've realized and learned as well is like it's 50% genetics, 50% your environment. So it's like both of them go into play.
Isn't it something your personality trait or something? 50% is genetics, 50% is you.
Yeah, something like along those lines. Yeah.
Yeah. See, genetics is an interesting one because it dictates so much. It feels like it can dictate a lot of your life without you even being responsible for it in a way. Whether it's health, like cancer, they say is genetically inherited. Heart disease, any cardiovascular disease. Unfortunately, some mental illnesses as well can be inherited. And then you've got, if you've like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, dementia, that can also be genetically. So, diseases outside of physiological disease, I would say. But, it's interesting.
Yeah, well, yeah, definitely. I mean, genetics, things you can't really control, right? But at the end of the day, you still have responsibility for yourself. And I think a lot of it is also your environment and things like that as well, that you have control over. With the environment, it's difficult. I mean, as a child, you can't really do much about that. But as when you come to a point of age where you're able to take decisions for yourself, then you're able to I guess change that. Even as a child, you can still change a couple of things. I mean, by that I mean obviously probably not physically, but I mean with the people you're around, with the information that you absorb. Those are things that you have control over. And that's also, I would say these days, other than the physical environment, the information you absorb and you listen to has a more impact than I would say even the friends you're around sometimes, because we spend more time on our phones than with people in this current day and age. So I would say those are two things you can control, which does affect your environment. And you'll see that like with certain types of groups of friends that are around, that you were around probably, had different impacts on you. You absorbed the qualities and traits subconsciously.
Yeah, you did. Yeah, that's true. It's what's the deal with the epigenetics?
Yeah, so epigenetics is like the environment. So we're just talking about environment, funny enough. But it's basically, but in the context of attachment, it's basically like what we were talking about before, which was like not being cared for. And by cared, it's like not just having a text in me like, yeah, good luck, or like all the best, or I love you, blah, 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 all that stuff. It's like physically being there is very important because, as we said, like oxytocin and those types of chemicals come from physical interaction. But obviously being neglected, you're going to have higher levels of stress and things like that, which will have negative impacts. It's really, I think a lot of it's really to do with the environment and whether it increases or decreases stress. Because when we look at it, even the research we looked at, the previous episode, is a lot of the factor was stress. If you're in a very unstable environment, financially, psychologically, or if there's illnesses involved and things like that, that's going to increase cortisol for the child especially. And I think that can alter your social behavior and your attachment style. Because when you're in an unstable environment, your cortisol levels are high. And being a child, your brain is very malleable. It creates memory trauma, memory loss, things like that. And then you can have negative views about other people and yourself if you get bullied a lot and there's like no one there to actually, at least listen to you, or at least give you some guidance. And I think that's the thing with epigenetics, environmental factors, and whether stress is increasing or decreasing.
There's plenty of environmental factors, that's for sure. I think we'll wrap up here, but I think the neuroscience behind this is absolutely incredible. I've learned a lot, but it seems like the amygdala, hippocampus go hand in hand. The 4 main hormones that or two main hormones is serotonin and oxytocin that are very important in terms of building trust, physical relationships,
Emotional stability.
Yep. And then dopamine is that point in time of that feel good in that point in time, and then cortisol is like the stress levels. So no, that's quite an interesting, very, very interesting episode. I'd say that.
Yeah, I think that's pretty well summarized. And yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's just being training in a more emotionally stable environment, which will increase oxytocin and serotonin, decrease cortisol, basically. And that will lead to more secure type of attachments.
Well said. Well, thanks, Sif. Thanks for your time. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and please follow us on the streaming services that you might be listening on.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Thanks, everyone. See you guys on the next one.